A racist and corrupt police officer handcuffed a black woman in front of her own child, but what he didn't know was that he had picked the wrong black woman that day, because the child who witnessed everything was the chief of police. And what happened to that officer shocked everyone. It started on a Tuesday. The kind of day that feels like it's not going anywhere. The sun high, the line at the gas station long, people just trying to move through life unnoticed. She was doing the same, just a woman getting gas, her son beside her, the routine of everyday life unfolding. But routine doesn't exist for people who are born into skin that's always questioned. When she walked into the gas station with cash in hand, no one expected her to walk back out humiliated, handcuffed, and labeled a criminal, all without a shred of evidence. The officer walked in with his chest puffed like the world owed him power. He glanced at her, then at the cashier, who looked uneasy. Maybe the cashier felt guilty. Maybe not. But it only took seconds for the tension to ignite. "What is this? You trying to pay with fake bills?" the cashier muttered, holding her $20 bill up to the light. Her son stepped forward to speak, but the officer raised a hand to stop him. "Step back," the officer snapped, eyes locked on the woman. "Where did you get this money?" She blinked, stunned. "It's cash. I got it from the ATM 2 blocks from here." "What are you talking about?" The officer didn't ask again. He didn't verify the bill. He didn't care about the ATM. He grabbed her wrist, spun her around, and shoved her against the glass door. "You think I haven't seen your kind trying this before? You people always got excuses." Her son froze. His eyes burned. His jaw locked. He didn't move, didn't scream, didn't throw himself between them, because something deeper boiled inside him. He knew this wasn't the first time this officer had done something like this. But it was the last time he would do it without consequence. She stood there, humiliated, wrists digging against cold metal, while people passed by pretending not to see. One man pulled out his phone and recorded. The officer laughed. "Go ahead," he barked, "let the world see what happens when someone thinks they're above the law." But what he didn't know was that the woman he was humiliating had raised a son who had worked his entire life to become the very embodiment of that law. A son who had dedicated decades to doing it the right way, not through fear, not through force, but through integrity. And while that officer had spent his career hiding behind his badge, abusing his authority and planting fear in communities that already lived with too much of it, the boy watching silently had become the man who could end that cycle. In that moment, he wasn't wearing his uniform. No badge, no radio, just a hoodie and jeans. But underneath all that, he was the most powerful law enforcement figure in the county, and that fact would hit the officer like a punch to the chest in the days to come. Because what the officer thought was a routine show of dominance would unravel into an explosive investigation. Cameras would catch what happened. Witnesses would speak. And behind closed doors, policies would begin to shift. But that's not what shocked people. What shocked people was what came next, when the son, now in full uniform, walked into the precinct and ordered an internal review. When sealed files were reopened. When testimonies from community members who had feared speaking out started to flood in. And when the officer, the same man who said, "You people always got excuses," realized that he was now the one without a voice. What began as a case of suspected counterfeit would snowball into a full-scale unraveling of a decorated officer's career. His house would be searched. His reports would be audited. His own colleagues, the ones who whispered about his conduct behind his back but never said it out loud, would now be forced to answer for their silence. And the woman he handcuffed? She would be the face of a movement. The symbol of a reform that wasn't just about punishment, but about truth. Because when the chief of police stood behind the podium days later and said, "I watched my mother get humiliated for being black. I watched her be treated like a criminal in front of me. And that moment changed everything," the entire city listened. The humiliation had come from a man who thought his uniform made him untouchable. But what he didn't realize was that he had handcuffed the mother of the man who would touch him, not with violence, not with revenge, but with justice so precise it would haunt him forever. And still, there was more. Something buried in the files. Something no one expected. A link between the officer and another case from years ago, a case the chief had always questioned. A connection that, once uncovered, would not only destroy reputations, but rewrite everything the city thought it knew about law enforcement. But what was that connection? Why did this officer, of all people, react so aggressively at that gas station? And how far was the chief willing to go to expose the full truth, even if it meant risking his own position? That day, the officer tried to crush a woman's dignity in public. But what he did instead was awaken the very storm that would drown him. And the city was never the same again. Now, are you ready to hear the full story? Before we begin, this is a message for every black viewer watching right now. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism. We believe in justice, dignity, and respect for every human being, no matter their color. If you've ever felt silenced, profiled, or disrespected because of your skin, let this story remind you, you are powerful. You matter. We're with you. And this story is for you. Enjoy the twist. And don't forget to subscribe to Plow of Twist for more stories that speak truth, spark emotion, and flip the script. The city of Shreveport, Louisiana, was not the kind of place that made national news often. Tucked between the remnants of its industrial past and the slow hum of everyday survival, it was a city where most people knew their neighbors, where history lived heavy in the air, and where the shadows of injustice clung to the corners of nearly every street. On the surface, it was quiet, steady. But beneath that calm, there were stories. Stories that shaped people. Stories that defined them. And one of those stories started long before a camera ever captured a handcuff clicking shut. Malik Henderson had never been the loudest voice in the room. Even as a child, there was a calmness to him that stood out, a stillness that made people think he was simply shy, but that in truth came from the weight he carried inside. His mother, Denise, used to say he was born an old soul. That while other kids threw tantrums or chased chaos, Malik watched, listened, absorbed. He was the kind of boy who could sit in a room full of noise and catch the one thing no one else noticed. And over the years, that quiet strength became his greatest weapon. Denise was a single mother. Not because she had planned it that way, but because life had other plans. She had Malik at 23, after a brief relationship with a man who vanished the moment fatherhood became more than a word. But Denise never let that define her. She was steel-wrapped in kindness, a woman who worked 2 jobs without ever complaining, who made a home feel rich with nothing but love, laughter, and discipline. She didn't raise Malik to be angry at the world, she raised him to understand it, to move through it with intelligence and strategy, to know when to speak and when to act. Their neighborhood wasn't the worst, but it wasn't safe either. On some nights, sirens replaced lullabies. On others, it was the silence after the noise that made people restless. But Malik didn't fall into the traps that caught so many of the kids around him. His mother's warnings echoed in his head every time a friend offered a shortcut. He watched too many lives fall apart over small decisions, and each one reinforced his belief that he had to stay focused. He studied hard, kept his circle small, and when the time came, he applied to the police academy, not because he loved the system, but because he believed someone like him needed to be inside it. At 28, Malik was already a decorated officer. By 33, he had become a captain. And by 37, he was the youngest chief of police Shreveport had ever seen. His rise was quiet but deliberate. He didn't make noise until it was necessary, but when he spoke, people listened. His reputation was built not just on competence but on fairness. Officers respected him, even if some feared the changes he represented. Community members trusted him, even those who still carried deep wounds from years of systemic abuse. He understood the politics of his position, but he never let it dilute his purpose. And then there was Denise. Even as her son rose in rank and responsibility, she remained the same. She still lived in the same modest house on Union Avenue, still drove the same old car, still worked part-time at the local library even though Malik insisted she didn't have to. For her, pride wasn't in titles, it was in character. She had raised her son to stand tall, but never above others. And she never used his position for favors, never mentioned his job to get out of trouble. She believed respect was earned through presence, not proximity to power. That belief would be tested in the most public, humiliating way possible. Officer Curtis Langley had been with the force for 21 years. He was one of those men who made people nervous without saying much. A presence that walked heavy into every room, eyes that scanned with suspicion before understanding. He had a record that looked clean on paper but was smudged with quiet complaints, community whispers, and internal reports that were buried as quickly as they were written. He had influence, not the kind that came from merit, but the kind built over time through favors, silence, and fear. Younger officers watched him and learned quickly which lines to follow and which to ignore. Langley wasn't openly racist, not in the way the media liked to portray. But everyone knew how he treated certain people. Everyone had seen it. And no one stopped it. He didn't know Denise. Not really. He might have seen her once or twice, a woman like any other, black, proud, too confident for his liking. That Tuesday morning, she had gone to the gas station out of routine. Her car needed fuel, and she had stopped at that same place for years. She wasn't expecting anything. She was wearing jeans, a faded t-shirt, her hair pulled back, her purse hanging on her shoulder like always. Malik had come with her, not because she needed him to, but because it was one of those rare mornings when they both had time, and he wanted to spend it with her. He was dressed in civilian clothes, nothing that marked him as anything more than a son. The station was quiet. A few people outside, the cashier behind the counter scrolling through his phone. Denise handed over a $20 bill and asked for 20 on pump 4. The cashier hesitated. Looked at the bill. Looked at her. Held the bill up. Malik noticed the shift in energy immediately. The tension entered the room like a fog, heavy and thick. The cashier mumbled something about checking the money. Denise raised her eyebrows but said nothing. She'd been through moments like that before. No need to escalate. Then Officer Langley walked in. He was off duty, but his presence filled the room like a warning. He saw the bill. Saw the cashier's unease. And made a decision not based on fact, but on assumption. He stepped forward, his voice louder than necessary, commanding attention. Asked Denise where she got the money. Asked again before she could answer. Accused. Doubted. Denied her any benefit of the doubt. Malik stepped forward, but Langley raised a hand. Told him to stand back. Told him not to interfere. Denise tried to explain, tried to reason. Said the money came from the ATM around the corner. Offered to show the receipt. Langley wasn't interested. He was already reaching for his cuffs. There was a moment, right then, that felt like it lasted hours. Malik could have stopped it. Could have pulled out his badge, his ID, could have ended it with a sentence. But something in him said not yet. Not like this. Not in this place, where so many people had been silenced without consequence. He watched as Langley handcuffed his mother, pressed her against the glass door, called her a fraud, told the cashier to call it in. He watched as people outside began to notice, some pulling out their phones, others turning away. He watched her stand there, silent and burning with dignity, refusing to scream or cry. He said nothing. Not yet. Because he knew that a badge flashed in that moment would only protect her, not fix the system. And Malik Henderson didn't want protection. He wanted change. What Officer Langley didn't realize was that the man standing silently in front of him wasn't just a bystander. He wasn't just some civilian with a camera or a kid with an attitude. He was his boss. And in a matter of days, that truth would unravel Langley's entire career. But for now, the scene at the gas station burned itself into memory. For now, the story was just beginning to turn. And the city of Shreveport, so used to burying its secrets, was about to watch one of them explode into the light. And no one, not even Malik, could have predicted just how deep the damage went. Or how powerful the reckoning would be when truth finally caught up. When the door to the precinct closed behind Malik Henderson that evening, the sound echoed louder in his ears than it should have. The station had always felt like neutral ground to him, a place of control, policy, responsibility. But now, every hallway carried the weight of that gas station. Every voice sounded slightly sharper. Every glance lingered a little longer. He knew it wasn't just in his head. People had seen the footage. It was already circulating, shaky, angled, caught from a cell phone at the edge of the pumps, but clear enough. Clear enough to show the handcuffs. Clear enough to hear the voice. Clear enough to make the truth undeniable. But no one had said anything to him yet. Not out loud. Not directly. And Malik didn't force it. He just walked to his office, closed the door, and sat in silence for 10 full minutes before finally breathing again. Across town, Denise sat at her kitchen table, staring at the same receipt she had tried to show the officer, the one that could have spared her the entire ordeal had anyone cared to see it. Her hands were steady, but her eyes told a different story. Not rage. Not defeat. But something more dangerous, clarity. For decades, she had played by the rules. She had taught Malik to do the same. But rules meant nothing if the people who enforced them didn't follow them too. Her son had always been her pride, but in that moment, she didn't need a chief. She needed him to be something more than his title. She needed him to remember the boy who watched the world through careful eyes. The one who never forgot a wrong, and who never let pain pass quietly. The following morning, Malik called an executive briefing. It was a standard procedure, or at least that's how he made it look. But beneath the surface, it was the first step in a storm that no one else saw coming. Around the conference table, lieutenants, captains, and senior officers took their seats. Officer Langley wasn't present. Malik didn't mention him. Not yet. He opened the meeting with updates on departmental priorities, crime reports, staffing adjustments. Routine. Measured. Calculated. Then he dropped it, a sentence disguised as policy, but weighted with intent. As of today, he said, we'll begin a comprehensive internal audit of all field interactions flagged by public complaint or identified through external footage over the past 5 years. A pause. Silence. Then murmurs. One of the older captains, a man with decades under his belt, cleared his throat and leaned forward. That's a pretty broad net, Chief. We talking thousands of incidents? Malik didn't blink. We are, another voice joined. You think that's necessary? We already have IA reviews in place. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel, are we? We're not reinventing, Malik said calmly. We're correcting. Starting with a case that occurred yesterday morning at the Texaco on Union and Pine. That incident's at the top of the list, it hit like thunder without lightning. They knew. Some of them had already seen the video. But no one had expected him to move this fast, or this precisely. And none of them, at that moment, knew just how personal this was. He didn't tell them yet. Not because he was hiding it. But because it wasn't time. Later that afternoon, Malik stood alone in the evidence room, reviewing archived footage and reports. His assistant, Nadia, came in quietly, holding a thick manila folder. This just came through, she said, setting it down. It's Langley's field reports from the last 3 years. You asked for anything related to civilian complaints that never reached IA. There's more than I expected. Malik opened the file slowly. He didn't speak. He just scanned, reports with inconsistencies, names he recognized from past community meetings, stories that now took on new meaning. It wasn't just one bad day. It was a pattern. A thread woven through years of unchecked power. And the deeper he looked, the more the picture shifted. That evening, Denise called. Her voice was quiet, but firm. You don't have to fix the world, baby. But you do have to make this right. Not for me. For everybody who didn't have someone like you watching. I know, Malik said. And I'm not going to stop. The next few days moved fast, but the pressure moved faster. Malik called for an internal ethics task force, assigning them authority to review closed cases connected to Langley. He requested civilian oversight on the review process, inviting members of the community into a system that had once shut them out. The media began circling. Rumors grew. People whispered that something big was coming, but no one could pin it down. Langley, for his part, didn't flinch. He walked through the precinct like a man above consequence. He joked in the break room, patted backs, told his own version of the gas station story to anyone who would listen. She came in with fake cash, he'd say. Gave me attitude, acted like she didn't have to explain anything. What was I supposed to do? Ignore protocol? But protocol didn't explain the language he used. The tone. The unnecessary force. And the video didn't lie. Malik watched it again and again, not because he needed to, but because it fueled something inside him. Not rage. Purpose. Every time he heard Langley say, "You people always got excuses," he felt his mother's silence in that moment echo through his chest. One morning, Malik walked into the break room as Langley was finishing a cup of coffee. Their eyes met. It was the first time since the incident they had stood in the same space. Langley smirked. "Morning, Chief. Busy week, huh?" Malik didn't smile. "We need to talk." "My office." Now the door closed behind them. Malik stood, arms folded. Langley sat down slowly, the smirk fading just enough to show tension behind his eyes. "You know why you're here," Malik said. Langley leaned back. "Look, if this is about the gas station thing, I was doing my job. Lady had fake cash, she resisted, I responded." Malik stepped forward. "You didn't verify the money. You didn't ask. You made a decision based on assumption, and you used language that has no place in this department. That's not how we operate. Not under my leadership." Langley's face tightened. "So what, now every time a cop makes a judgment call, we get dragged through fire?" "This isn't about judgment," Malik said. "It's about a pattern. And we have more than enough evidence to prove it. There's a formal investigation underway. Your record is being reviewed. And until it's concluded, you're suspended, effective immediately." Langley stood. His voice rose. "You're making a mistake. I've got 20 years on the force. I've earned respect. I've earned my place." Malik's voice was calm, but deadly clear. "Respect isn't something you keep when you abuse it." The door opened. A representative from Internal Affairs stepped in. Langley was escorted out, not in cuffs, not yet, but stripped of the authority he had worn like armor for decades. Word spread quickly. Whispers turned to full conversations. The media got wind of the suspension, but not the reason. Not yet. Malik kept his statements brief. Measured. But behind closed doors, he moved with precision. Files were reopened. Interviews were scheduled. Officers who had once looked the other way were now being asked to account for what they'd ignored. At home, Denise watched it all unfold from the quiet of her living room. She never asked for updates, but Malik gave them anyway. Not the details, just enough to let her know that justice, however slow, was starting to move. On the 6th day, something unexpected happened. An anonymous tip came through. A name, a date, a report from over a decade ago. A case Malik remembered well, a teenager arrested for resisting, but whose record never matched the force used in the arrest. That case had always felt off. The name of the arresting officer hadn't stood out at the time. But now, in this new light, it glowed like a flare. The pieces were aligning. And the truth that was about to be uncovered wouldn't just shake the department. It would shatter the entire illusion of who Langley was. Because buried in the paperwork, hidden in the testimonies, there was a link, a quiet, damning connection that would turn this from a case of misconduct into something far darker. Malik stared at the file long after everyone else had gone home. The precinct was quiet. The city outside buzzed with indifference. But inside that room, a reckoning was taking shape. And as he turned the final page of the report, the question wasn't whether justice would be served. It was how far the truth would reach once it was unleashed. Something had been hiding for years. And what Malik was about to find, would change everything. The rain had started to fall just after sunset, soft at first, then steady, coating the streets of Shreveport in a thin silver sheen that made everything feel quieter, heavier. Inside the precinct, the walls seemed to absorb the tension that had built over the past several days. There was no longer any need for speculation. The whispers were done. The facts were here. The internal review had reached its final layer, and what Malik had discovered in the depths of those records had changed the shape of everything. It wasn't just about misconduct. It wasn't just about excessive force. It was about a cover-up, deliberate, intentional, and tied to a case that had once haunted Malik during his early years on the force. Now it all made sense. 11 years ago, a 17-year-old boy had been brought in, bloodied, silent, and confused. The charge had been resisting arrest after a supposed altercation in a corner store. But the store owner had never filed a complaint. The security footage mysteriously disappeared. The boy pled out under pressure from a public defender who barely looked at the file. Malik had been a young officer then, not even close to the command level, and not involved in the arrest. But he had passed the kid in the hallway the day of his processing. The look in the boy's eyes had stayed with him, not fear, but disbelief. Like the world had tilted and no one else had noticed. That boy's name was Corey Jennings. And now, through the reports and signatures, it was clear, the arresting officer had been Curtis Langley. But that wasn't the revelation that changed everything. The real twist came from a transcript, tucked into the back of a sealed envelope, one that had never been filed properly, a handwritten note from an internal witness who, at the time, had tried to report what happened that night. The note described Langley roughing the kid up, planting a stolen item in his pocket, and laughing afterward like it was just another shift. But the report had never made it into IA. It was buried. And it had stayed buried, until now. Malik stood in front of the conference room window, watching the rain slice down the glass, the report open in his hands. Nadia stood behind him, her arms crossed, eyes tight with restraint. "You're sure you want to do this tonight?" she asked quietly. Malik didn't look away from the rain. "There's no more waiting." He's still in uniform. Still walking these halls like he owns them. He needs to be in that chair when this comes out. She nodded once and left without another word. Within 15 minutes, the command team was assembled, not all of them, but the ones who mattered. Langley entered last, casually, as if nothing could possibly touch him. He sat across from Malik, leaned back, arms wide on the chair. "What's this about now?" he asked, forcing a chuckle. "Another training refresh?" Malik closed the report slowly. He didn't rush. He wanted every second to weigh on the air. "We're here to discuss a pattern of behavior," he began, voice measured. "And a specific case that's come to light through the course of this investigation. A case that predates most of the team in this room, but not you." Langley's face twitched, barely. "You'll have to be more specific." "Corey Jennings," Malik said, watching him carefully. "Arrested at 17. You were the lead officer on the scene. The charge was resisting, but the circumstances didn't match the records. You filed a report. Claimed he had stolen a wallet. Claimed he swung at you. No surveillance footage. No complaint from the store. And now," Malik reached for the folder and pulled out the note, "we have a witness statement from an officer who was there that night. A rookie who said he saw you plant the wallet yourself. Langley shifted in his seat, the casual air beginning to crack. You've got to be kidding me. That was over a decade ago. You're digging into ghost stories now. This isn't a ghost story, Malik said, sharper now. This is a confession. And a pattern. You've done this before. You escalate. You provoke. You write the narrative before the facts even come in. And you've gotten away with it because nobody stopped you. Until now. Langley's face hardened. You really think you're some kind of hero? You think digging up dirt makes you clean? You don't belong in that seat. You were just lucky enough to play the game. Malik didn't blink. No, I was smart enough not to break the rules while I played it. And brave enough to change them once I got here. The silence after that was absolute. No one around the table spoke. Langley's breathing had quickened, his jaw clenched. This is a setup, he muttered. You're just mad I cuffed your mama in public. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Malik's voice dropped to a tone no one had heard from him before. You think this is about revenge? You think I waited all these years, worked through this system, climbed every step just to retaliate over one moment? He leaned forward, eyes locked on Langley's. This is about every kid who never made it past that holding cell. Every mother who had to tell her child why the police weren't safe. Every time someone like you wore this badge like it gave you the right to decide who mattered and who didn't. This isn't about you and me. This is about right and wrong. And you're standing on the wrong side of both. Langley opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He stood abruptly, pushing his chair back. You don't have anything solid, he said, but the words lacked power now. You can't prove it in court. It's hearsay. Malik held up another paper. The witness is willing to testify. And we've reopened 3 other cases where your reports contradict body cam footage and dispatch records. This isn't hearsay anymore. It's a pattern. And the DOJ will see it the same way. Langley didn't sit back down. He didn't have to. The door opened, and 2 federal agents stepped in. One of them nodded at Malik, then approached Langley. Officer Langley, we're placing you under federal investigation for civil rights violations, evidence tampering, and abuse of authority. You're to surrender your badge and weapon immediately. The room didn't move. Langley looked at Malik one last time. You think they're gonna let you keep running this place when they see how fast you turned on your own? Malik stood, slow and steady. I didn't turn on anyone. I just stopped protecting the wrong people. Langley was escorted out of the room, past officers who once shook his hand and laughed at his jokes. Now, no one looked him in the eye. Back in his office, Malik closed the door and exhaled. The storm had hit, but it wasn't over yet. The charges were just the beginning. What they would uncover in the weeks to come would ripple far beyond one man. Systems would be questioned. Policies rewritten. And for the first time, the department would have to face itself in the mirror. Malik looked out into the city, rain still falling, streets still moving like nothing had changed. But everything had. The arrest wasn't the end of the story. It was just the start of the reckoning. And the truth he was about to reveal to the public, the part no one saw coming, was what would truly leave the city in shock. The rain had stopped by morning, but the city hadn't settled. The news of Officer Langley's federal investigation had broken overnight, and by sunrise, local stations had already begun their coverage. The headlines didn't hold back: veteran officer under federal investigation, police chief orders internal crackdown, new evidence ties officer to civil rights abuses. Malik stood in his office as his phone buzzed non-stop: emails, texts, missed calls from journalists, city officials, activists, even old academy friends he hadn't heard from in years. But he wasn't ready to speak publicly yet. Not until one more thing was done. He stared at the framed photo on his desk, him and his mother, taken on the day of his swearing-in. She hadn't smiled much in photos, but that day, she had. That smile wasn't just for him, it was for every fight she'd survived to see that moment. And now, the weight of that photo felt different. It felt prophetic. Denise was sitting at the dining table, the television on mute, when Malik arrived. Her hands were folded, her eyes steady on the screen where Langley's face looped silently in a grainy arrest photo. She didn't turn when he entered, didn't speak. Malik sat across from her and waited. Finally, she exhaled and looked up, her voice low. "They're saying he could face real prison time. That's what this means, right?" Malik nodded slowly, his throat tight. "That's what it means. The charges are real. And there's more coming. I didn't realize how deep it went until I saw the files." Until people started speaking, Denise studied him, her eyes not cold but unreadable. "And you're ready for the fallout? Because this ain't just about him now. This is going to shake everything." Malik leaned in. "I'm not backing away. Not now. He hurt people. Silenced them. He made it personal the second he put his hands on you like you weren't human. But this is bigger than us. This is about every life he twisted, every lie he wrote that changed the course of someone else's story. I've got the proof. I've got the backing. And I'm going to make sure this never gets buried again." Denise didn't cry. She never cried. Instead, she reached across the table and placed her hand on top of his. "Then say it. To them. To everyone. They need to hear it from you." Later that day, the press conference was called. The City Hall chamber was packed, not just with reporters but with community members, officers, clergy, and activists. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Cameras flashed, microphones were checked, and then Malik stepped forward to the podium, his uniform crisp, his shoulders square, but his voice carrying something no badge or rank could deliver: truth. He didn't open with pleasantries. No thanks, no introductions. He began with a story. "Years ago," he said, "I was a young officer, still trying to understand the system I had stepped into. One night, I watched a teenager walk into this building in handcuffs. His name was Corey Jennings. He was bleeding. He was scared. And his arrest never made sense to me. I asked questions, but I didn't push. I told myself the system would handle it. That justice would happen if I stayed in line and worked hard. But justice doesn't just happen. Justice is built. And silence tears it down faster than any bad law ever could." He paused. The room was silent. Today, Officer Curtis Langley was suspended and placed under federal investigation for a series of civil rights violations, use of excessive force, and evidence tampering spanning over a decade. Thanks to newly uncovered testimony and corroborated records, we now know that Officer Langley fabricated charges, manipulated reports, and planted evidence in multiple cases, including the wrongful arrest of Corey Jennings, who was 17 at the time. Mr. Jennings' life was derailed by that arrest. He never got the chance to go to college. He spent time in a facility for a crime he didn't commit. His mother died while he was still serving that sentence. And no one ever apologized to him. A murmur swept through the crowd, but Malik continued, louder now. And that wasn't the only one. We've identified at least 7 cases that follow the same pattern. And we believe there are more. These cases are being reopened, and every single person who suffered at the hands of this injustice will be contacted. Some of them may never get back the time that was stolen. But they will get the truth. And they will get the apology they deserve, not just from me, but from the system that failed them. A reporter raised a hand, but Malik wasn't done. "There's one more thing I need to say. The woman Officer Langley arrested last week, the woman accused of using counterfeit money without a shred of proof, is my mother. He didn't know who she was. He didn't care. And that's exactly the problem. That could have been anyone. That has been so many of you. So many of us. And if I hadn't been there, hadn't seen it with my own eyes, it would have happened again. It would have disappeared into paperwork. But not this time." He stepped back from the mic. The room exploded, flashes, questions, shouts, but Malik didn't wait. He turned and walked out the side door, back into the hallway, his breath shallow, his chest tight. Outside, people began to chant. Not against him, but in solidarity. A voice among them called his name, not Chief, just Malik. And that meant everything. Later that night, sitting in the precinct's archive room, Malik flipped through more files. A young officer, Terrence Cole, walked in, visibly shaken. He was new, maybe a year on the job, but his hands trembled with something more than nerves. "I need to talk to you," Terrence said. "About Langley. About what I saw last year. I should have come forward earlier. I didn't know what to do. But I can't stay quiet anymore." Malik looked up, heart heavy but steady. "You're not the only one coming forward. And you're not too late." The next morning, more calls came in. More people, civilians, ex-officers, even someone from internal affairs, reached out with stories, files, leads. It wasn't just Langley anymore. It was about a system that had protected him, turned a blind eye, chosen comfort over accountability. Malik took it all. He didn't delegate. He read every statement. He listened to every voice. Because if this was going to be torn down, it had to be done completely. And it had to be rebuilt with truth. 3 days later, Malik sat in a quiet diner on the edge of the city. Corey Jennings walked in, older now, his face lined with years of loss, but his eyes clear. They sat across from each other, no cameras, no press. "You remember me?" Corey asked. Malik nodded. "I never forgot." Corey leaned forward. "Why now? After all this time?" Malik swallowed hard. "Because I should have spoken up back then. And because you deserve more than just a file update. You deserve to hear from someone who sees you. Who believes you. Who's sorry for what we didn't stop." Corey didn't say anything for a long time. Then he looked out the window, watching the rain return. "You know what I lost?" Malik nodded again. "I do know," Corey said. "You feel it. But you don't know. My mom. My time. My peace. They took all of it." Malik didn't argue. He just sat there with him, the silence doing what words couldn't. But Corey turned back to him, his voice rough. "But this matters. You saying it. You showing up. That matters. Just don't stop now. Don't let this die in another report." "I won't," Malik said. "I promise." And when they shook hands before parting ways, it wasn't just forgiveness being exchanged. It was power. Not the kind that comes from badges or ranks. But the kind that builds something new from the rubble of everything that went wrong. What no one in the city knew yet was that the real wave was still coming. Because Malik was about to make one final move, the release of Langley's full record, including the list of officers who had shielded him over the years. And when that came out, no one in the department would be able to say they didn't know. And the truth, raw, unfiltered, undeniable, would leave the city changed forever. By the end of the week, the entire department felt different. Not quieter, not even close, but raw, exposed, as if every hallway and office had been stripped down to its foundation. Officers spoke in hushed tones now, their steps a little slower, their eyes glancing longer at one another. Malik walked through those halls like a man carrying fire in his hands, not to destroy, but to illuminate. Word had spread about the files he intended to release, and everyone knew what that meant. Accountability was no longer a distant concept reserved for press conferences or disciplinary forums. It was here, sitting on Malik's desk in a sealed envelope that he read over and over again, not because he doubted its truth, but because he needed to feel its weight before placing it into the world. The list contained more than just Langley's misconduct. It was a chronicle of silence, names of officers who had signed off on falsified reports, who had failed to intervene during questionable arrests, who had received complaints and ignored them. It wasn't about demonizing the entire force. Malik knew that narrative wouldn't hold. But it was about drawing a line. This was the moment where the culture would either shift permanently or snap back under the pressure of its own denial. The city council demanded a meeting. The mayor called Malik 3 times before he finally agreed to show up. Inside that chamber, it was as if time had slowed. The room was packed, not with civilians this time, but with officials, attorneys, police union reps, and a dozen microphones waiting to dissect his every word. Malik stood before them not as a symbol, but as a man with a decision to defend, and one he had no intention of walking back. The council chair leaned forward, voice steady but defensive. "Chief Henderson, releasing this kind of internal documentation puts the entire department at risk of civil litigation. You do understand that, right?" Malik met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes, and I accept that risk. Because the greater risk is what happens when we continue protecting people who should have been removed years ago. The lawsuits are coming either way. But this time, we'll be on the right side of them." A younger councilwoman, one who had publicly supported police reform in the past but often buckled under pressure, asked cautiously, "What about the officers who made mistakes but changed? Are we burning down the house over something they've already learned from?" Malik paused. That was the question that lingered in his own mind late at night. The difference between justice and vengeance was thin, and he refused to cross it. This isn't about punishing growth. It's about addressing patterns. If an officer acknowledged a past error, sought correction, and stopped the behavior, then they have nothing to fear. But if someone used that badge as a shield for misconduct and continued to do so because no one stopped them, then they're part of the problem. And they will be held accountable. There was no applause. No standing ovation. Just a cold, restless silence. And that was enough. That evening, Malik sat in the quiet of his office, the city's hum far in the background. Nadia came in, carrying a tablet, her eyes tired but still burning with focus. "You need to see this," she said, placing the screen in front of him. It was a live stream. A group of young protesters had gathered outside the precinct, not in anger, but in solidarity. They held signs that didn't scream for chaos, but demanded something far more powerful: truth, protection, real leadership. A young black boy, maybe 12, stood with a sign that read, "Do the right thing, even when it's hard." Malik watched him for a long time. That boy didn't know it, but he had just described the very thing Malik had wrestled with in private for years. The idea that leadership meant carrying burdens others didn't want. That doing what was right might cost him the loyalty of colleagues, the support of politicians, and maybe even his career. But the truth was, Malik had never wanted the job for status. He had wanted it to break a cycle. And now, staring at the crowd of people asking him not to give up, he knew he was doing exactly what he was supposed to. The next morning, he released the files. It wasn't a press event. There were no speeches, no dramatic unveiling. The department's website was updated with a public portal, one that allowed citizens to view summaries of internal investigations, disciplinary actions, and patterns of repeated behavior. Identifying details were redacted where legally necessary, but the data spoke volumes. It was a move no department in the state had made before. Within hours, news outlets picked it up. Activists praised it. Union leaders condemned it. But Malik didn't flinch. He knew this was the cost of truth. The backlash came fast. Emails accusing him of betrayal. Anonymous threats. An officer left his badge on Malik's desk with a note that read, "You just killed morale." Hope it was worth it. Some senior staff members requested transfers. But something else began to happen, quietly and steadily. New recruits approached him in the hallway, eyes wide with something like hope. Officers who had felt powerless for years came forward, sharing what they'd seen but never dared report. Even a few veterans, hardened by decades of silence, started to whisper, "It's about time," and then came the real dilemma. 2 days after the files went public, Malik received a confidential envelope from a retired sergeant who had once worked alongside Langley. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a flash drive. The letter explained that, years ago, Langley had worked undercover with a private security group hired by a local real estate mogul, a man who had been buying up property in low-income black neighborhoods. The goal had been to clean up the area, to drive prices up. The strategy? Use law enforcement to create records of crime where there was none. False arrests. Harassment. Intimidation. Langley had been one of the top enforcers of that tactic. The drive contained recordings, audio files of meetings between Langley and the developer. Proof. Names. Dates. Instructions. And worst of all, a list of families forced out of their homes due to those records. This wasn't just departmental corruption. It was systemic displacement funded by greed and executed under the guise of public safety. Malik listened to the recordings in silence, his hands shaking not with fear, but with the rage of recognition. His own neighborhood was on that list. His mother's street. People he'd known his entire life. Some of them had left without ever knowing why the pressure got so heavy so fast. Now he knew. The question that kept him up that night wasn't whether to go public, he knew he would. The question was whether the city could survive knowing how deep the betrayal had gone. Whether justice could be served without burning everything to the ground. He met with the mayor behind closed doors. Presented the evidence. Laid out a plan for a full investigation, restitution for displaced families, and criminal charges against the real estate mogul. The mayor looked at him for a long time and then said, "If this comes out, the city's going to erupt." Malik didn't hesitate. "It already has. You're just hoping no one notices the smoke." And when the press received the story the next day, not from Malik, but from the family of a woman who'd been evicted based on one of Langley's falsified reports, there was no more hiding. Protests swelled. Not just outside the precinct, but at City Hall, the courthouse, even at the offices of the development firms involved. It wasn't chaos. It was clarity, loud and painful and long overdue. Inside all of this, Malik stood firm. Not untouched, not invincible. But present. He took every question. Faced every accusation. Answered with the same calm voice that had once made people underestimate him. And when someone asked him if he regretted anything, he said only this: "I regret not starting sooner." But in the midst of this reckoning, Malik was also confronted with something deeper, a fear that had lived inside him for years. That in trying to fix the system from within, he had become too much a part of it. That he had walked so many careful lines, he didn't know which side of the fight he stood on anymore. So he returned to where it started. He drove to the gas station where Langley had cuffed his mother. The lot was quiet. The pump where it happened still stood, untouched. He got out of the car and walked up to it, running his fingers along the edge. A woman came out of the store, the same cashier who had worked that day. She recognized him immediately, but didn't speak. Just nodded. "I came to see it," Malik said softly. Not for anger. Just to remember. The woman hesitated. "I should have said something. I knew it didn't feel right." "You're not the only one," Malik replied. "But now you can." And when he got back in his car, he wasn't sure what the next chapter would hold. But he knew one thing for certain: the city would never be the same. And neither would he. The weight of silence lingered over Shreveport like humidity clinging to every wall and windowpane. After the storm of revelations, after the files were made public, after the tapes exposed more than anyone was ready for, there came a strange stillness. But it wasn't peace. It was the pause before everything rearranged itself. Malik sat alone in his office, the blinds half closed, the hum of the city drifting in through a cracked window. Outside, the protests had thinned, not because people were giving up, but because they were watching now, waiting to see if all the truth pouring out of sealed envelopes and redacted files would lead to something real. And inside the department, no one could pretend anymore. No one could say they didn't know. The truth had broken the dam. That morning, Denise walked into Malik's office without knocking. She hadn't come by the station since everything went public, but there was something about the way she carried herself that said she was done watching from the sidelines. She sat across from him, calm but firm, her eyes cutting straight through the fog he'd been walking around in. She looked around, her gaze tracing the plaques on the walls, the framed commendations, the medals behind glass. "All these years," she said quietly, "and I kept thinking that if you just got high enough, it would change. That if you climbed far enough, the view would be different. But the higher you go, the more of the rot you see, don't you?" Malik leaned back in his chair, his hands folded tightly. "I used to think I could fix it from the inside. That if I was good enough, if I never gave them a reason to doubt me, I could make space for the truth. But it's not about space anymore. It's about pushing everything out into the light, no matter who gets uncomfortable." Denise didn't flinch. "And do you still believe it's worth saving? After all this?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at his hands, at the desk, at the file still open in front of him, names, dates, timelines of coordinated efforts to displace entire blocks of families like theirs. "I believe people deserve safety. I believe they deserve justice. I believe some of these officers, the ones who joined because they actually wanted to help, they deserve to work in a place that isn't sick at the core. So yeah, it's worth saving. But maybe not in the way we thought. Maybe we're not rebuilding a house, we're burning the old one down and building something else on top of the ashes." She let that sit for a moment before nodding slowly. "Then burn it right." Later that afternoon, Malik met with his command staff. The room was quieter than usual, filled with a new generation of officers, those who had stayed through the storm not out of fear or denial, but because they wanted to be part of what came next. Some had been complicit by silence. Others had known something was wrong and said nothing. Now they were looking to him for direction, not just as a leader, but as the man who had cracked the truth wide open. He addressed them not as a chief, but as a man who had watched his own mother be dehumanized in public. "This department doesn't need another memo," he said. "It needs a reckoning. What we've done up to this point is only the beginning. From here on, every new hire will go through civilian review. Every complaint will be visible to the public within 10 days. We're establishing a new accountability board, one that I won't control, one that reports directly to the community. If you're not ready for that kind of transparency, if you can't serve under those standards, you're free to leave. No shame in it. But this is the line in the sand. We don't go back from here." No one moved. No one spoke. But Malik could see it, some nodding slightly, some gripping their seats a little tighter, others blinking harder than usual. He could feel the room shifting. Not all at once. But enough. That night, he met with the families of those who had been impacted by Langley's actions. Corey Jennings sat near the front, arms crossed, eyes sharp but not angry anymore, just watching. A woman named Mrs. Tinsley, whose grandson had been arrested 3 times by the same group of officers under false charges, stood up and spoke for the first time in public. Her voice trembled, but the room fell silent to hear her. "I never thought I'd live long enough to see someone like you admit what we all knew," she said, looking at Malik. "But now that it's out, you better not disappear on us. Don't turn into one of them. Don't let this be just another wave." Malik stood, his voice steady. "I won't disappear. And I won't let this die. Not while I'm still breathing." Afterward, Corey approached him. There was no anger in his voice now, just clarity. "You did what most wouldn't. But you know this isn't over, right?" "I know," Malik replied, "because some of the people who covered for Langley, they still work here. They still think they can wait this out." Malik nodded. "Not anymore. The waiting's over." For all of us, the following week, the Department of Justice arrived. Not as enemies, but as partners. Malik had requested their involvement, not to take over, but to review, to help restructure, to lend credibility to what would otherwise seem like internal politics. It wasn't an easy decision. No chief wants to invite the federal government into their backyard. But Malik knew this wasn't his backyard anymore. It belonged to the people who had bled on its pavement. With the DOJ's help, a new task force was formed, one that included civilians, lawyers, former public defenders, and yes, even officers who had been cleared of any misconduct. They began to interview community members, re-investigate old cases, and track the money trail that connected Langley to the real estate developers. Malik sat in those meetings not as a figurehead, but as a participant. He listened, he answered, he admitted when the department had failed. And each time, something inside him loosened. Not relief. Not redemption. Just the beginning of repair. And then came the call he had been bracing for. Langley's attorney was requesting a private meeting. At first, Malik refused. There was nothing left to say. But curiosity got the better of him. Not because he wanted closure, but because he needed to understand what kind of man did the things Langley had done and still slept at night. They met in an empty interview room, no cameras, no press. Langley looked smaller now, aged by the weight of exposure. But his eyes still carried something Malik recognized, resentment, not regret. "You came here to gloat?" Langley asked, voice rough. Malik shook his head. "I came here to hear the truth." "Your truth?" "Because I want to know if you ever really believed what you were doing was right," Langley scoffed. "Right? Doesn't matter. You think you're some kind of hero now. You think this is justice." "It's a start," Malik said. "But justice would be seeing every person you hurt walk away free, with their lives back. I can't give them that. But I can give them the truth. You took that from them. And now, I'm taking it back." Langley leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You think tearing all this down is gonna make the city better? You'll see. They'll turn on you, too. The moment they feel unsafe, the moment you can't promise perfection, they'll come for your badge just like they came for mine." Malik stared at him for a long moment. "If they do, at least I'll know I stood on the right side of it. That's something you'll never have." And with that, he left. Not triumphant. Not victorious. Just clearer. The consequences were still unfolding. Officers were resigning. Others were stepping up. The community was beginning to breathe differently, cautiously, like someone who had been underwater too long and didn't quite trust the air yet. But change was happening. Not in sweeping speeches or dramatic gestures, but in quiet decisions, in rewrites of policy, in the way people looked at Malik now, not as a barrier, but as a bridge. And through all of it, he carried the same steady fire. Not to destroy, but to light the way forward. Because the final reckoning was still coming. And it would demand more than just truth, it would demand transformation. The days moved with a slow intensity after that last meeting with Langley. Shreveport was no longer on edge, it was evolving. What had started as a scandal had stretched into a full-blown transformation, but Malik knew the hardest part was never the explosion. It was the aftermath. It was what came after the cameras stopped flashing, after the city's attention shifted to something else. That's when real change either took root or quietly collapsed under the weight of old habits. He had seen it before. The outrage, the outcry, the performative gestures, all fading into silence. But this time, something was different. The people weren't stepping back. They were leaning in. And Malik could feel the city looking to him, not for reassurance, but for direction. One afternoon, he was called into a community meeting organized by the new Civilian Oversight Board. It was held in a local church, the pews packed with families, teachers, students, activists, voices from every corner of the city. Malik didn't come to speak, at least not at first. He came to listen. The room was warm with emotion. People stood one by one and shared their truths, stories of fear, of harassment, of walking their children past officers with their heads down because they never believed protection included them. A woman named Yvonne stood at the front, her voice shaking not from weakness but from the effort of holding years of silence inside. "I used to tell my son to keep his hands out of his pockets, even when it was freezing," she said, looking straight at Malik. "I told him to never run, even if someone was chasing him. I taught him to shrink himself. Because I didn't believe this city would see him as a boy first. I thought they'd see him as a threat. And for years, I believed I was just being cautious. But now I see, I was adapting to injustice. I don't want to do that anymore. Malik stood slowly and walked to the front, his hands at his sides, his voice stripped of authority and standing. You weren't wrong to be cautious. You were trying to survive in a system that demanded fear for safety. And I can't undo what made you teach your son to hide. But I swear to you, from this day forward, no child in this city should have to learn fear as a form of protection. The room exhaled. Not with relief, but with recognition. This wasn't about one man fixing everything. It was about someone in power finally saying, "We were wrong." After the meeting, an older man named Vernon approached Malik in the parking lot. He was a retired factory worker, tall and proud, with a cane in one hand and a folder in the other. His eyes held stories that didn't need to be told out loud. He handed the folder to Malik and said, "My brother was arrested in 1994. Drugs, they said. But he didn't use. Didn't sell. I've carried this for years, thinking it wouldn't matter. Maybe now it does." Malik opened the folder that night, reading through handwritten letters, a decades-old mugshot, and court documents that bore signatures of names he now knew too well. It wasn't just Langley's pattern, it was the system's fingerprints, all over another stolen life. He made a note, logged it into the reopened case list, and sent a message to the oversight board. This story would be heard too. Meanwhile, inside the department, a quiet reckoning was underway. Officers who once walked through the precinct with untouchable pride now found themselves questioned, their records revisited, their choices confronted. Some resigned. Others stayed, defensive and brittle. But there was a growing number, a younger generation, officers who had joined with purpose and were now finding their courage. Malik met regularly with them in private sessions, listening to their fears, their anger, their confusion. One officer, a black woman named Simone Hayes, had tears in her eyes as she spoke during one of those sessions. "I joined this force because I wanted to change what I grew up afraid of. I thought I could be the face that made someone feel safe. But I've felt alone since I got here. I've watched things I couldn't explain. And I stayed quiet because I didn't think anyone would back me up. And now I feel guilty for not doing more. What does that make me?" Malik looked at her, his voice firm and gentle. "It makes you honest. And human. And brave enough to stand in front of that truth now instead of burying it. That guilt doesn't disqualify you. It qualifies you to help change this place." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that heals. Malik left that meeting more convinced than ever that the change he was leading wasn't just about discipline or exposure, it was about rebuilding identity. What did it mean to wear the badge now? What should it mean? And who was willing to carry that weight with honor? As the weeks passed, more cases resurfaced. Some led to dropped charges. Others prompted formal apologies from the city. Malik issued letters to the families of every individual proven to be wrongfully arrested under Langley's shadow. Each letter was handwritten. Not drafted by staff. Not signed in ink without thought. He sat at his desk night after night, his handwriting stiff from the weight of it all. He knew it wasn't enough. That no letter could return lost years or undo a mother's grief. But it was a start. A seed of something better. One afternoon, Malik visited the home of Jerome Tinsley, Mrs. Tinsley's grandson, whose name had been cleared just days before. Jerome had spent years in and out of detention because of fabricated charges that began with one encounter. Now 25, he opened the door with hesitation, unsure of what to expect. Malik stepped in, took off his cap, and said, "I came to say this in person. You deserved better. You still do. And we're going to make sure that happens." Jerome sat down, looking away for a moment. "I thought I was broken," he admitted. "I thought maybe they were right about me. And then I stopped trying. Because what was the point?" Malik leaned forward. "The point is you're still here. You survived something most people can't imagine. And you're not the one who should have been ashamed. They talked for over an hour. Not about police or reform or politics. About books. About music. About what Jerome wanted to do if he ever felt safe enough to dream again. When Malik left, Jerome stood a little taller. In the weeks that followed, Malik continued the work, endless hearings, policy rewrites, neighborhood visits. He gave interviews, some hostile, others reverent. He turned down offers to leave the department for national platforms. He wasn't done yet. This city still needed its reckoning. And he hadn't finished delivering it. Then came the message from Nadia one morning as he walked in. "You need to see this," she said, handing him a letter. It was from a former officer who had quietly resigned 2 years ago after filing complaints against Langley that went ignored. In the letter, the man confessed to having kept copies of documents, arrest records, disciplinary memos that had been shredded, memos altered to protect Langley and a few other high-ranking names. He offered to turn them over to help set the record straight. Malik sat with that letter, heart pounding not from fear, but from vindication. The truth was like water, it found a way. Always. And now that it had started flowing, it wasn't stopping. But even amid this wave of accountability, Malik faced resistance from within. A city council member who had been exposed for defending developers connected to the displacement scheme publicly challenged Malik's authority, accusing him of overreach and emotional governance. Malik addressed it the next day during a city broadcast. "If emotion means refusing to be numb to injustice, then I accept the charge. If leadership means protecting power over people, then strip me of the title. But I will not lead quietly while lives are erased by silence. Not in this city. Not on my watch." And the people responded, not with riots, but with resolve. Petitions formed. Voter turnout spiked. Public trust began, cautiously, to return. And Malik found himself walking the streets not as a symbol of the system, but as someone finally seen as its challenger. Children waved at him again. Elders pulled him aside to whisper thank yous. And through it all, Denise remained steady, her voice still calm, her presence still sharp, her pride quiet but present in every step her son took toward rebuilding the city that had once tried to break them. But the end wasn't here yet. Malik could feel it. There was one more thing to do. And it would be the most powerful act of all. Months later, the echoes of change still moved through Shreveport like a steady rhythm, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakably present. It was in the way the community meetings grew fuller, how neighbors once too afraid to speak now stood at the mic without trembling. It was in the language of policy rewritten by voices that had never been invited into the room. It was in the way Denise Henderson walked into her library job with her head higher, no longer wondering whether her son's sacrifice would lead to anything real. And above all, it was in the space Malik created, not with grand speeches, but with relentless, deliberate action that rebuilt trust where betrayal had rooted itself for generations. Curtis Langley was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. The trial didn't drag, because the evidence didn't bend. He sat through the proceedings stone-faced, but by the time the final testimony was delivered, one from a teenager whose life he had shattered nearly a decade earlier, his silence began to break. Not into remorse, but into the dull realization that power, once lost, leaves a man completely hollow when that's all he ever built himself on. His name no longer shielded him. The badge was gone. And in its place was a legacy that would forever be known for everything he tried to hide. The real estate mogul involved in the displacement scheme was indicted too, facing financial penalties and community reparations that would reallocate millions back into housing and youth programs in the neighborhoods they targeted. The properties once used to evict families were turned over to community trusts, to be governed by the people who had been pushed out. Families began returning. Some rebuilt. Others found closure. But the damage was acknowledged, named, and addressed, finally. Simone Hayes, the young officer who once questioned whether she belonged, became a leading voice in the department's new reform unit. She wasn't perfect, but she was courageous. And that mattered more. She led trainings that weren't about technical procedures, but about empathy, about the power of listening, about the humanity behind every badge and every civilian face. Young recruits followed her example, not because she was loud, but because she was clear, firm, and rooted in something real. She became the model of what policing could look like when guided by conscience. Corey Jennings used the city's apology funds not to disappear, but to launch a mentorship program for young men who had grown up in the same system that tried to erase him. He called it the Watchtower, because, as he said, we're done hiding in the dark. He worked with schools, courts, and counselors, helping to rewrite the narrative for kids whose first experience with authority had been fear. And when asked why he wasn't bitter, he always replied, because I survived. And surviving means I still get to build something better. As for Malik, he did what few expected. He stepped down. Not in disgrace. Not under pressure. But on his own terms. 2 years after the storm broke, after the reforms had rooted and the culture had begun to reshape, he called a press conference, stood at that same podium, and announced his resignation, not as a retreat, but as an evolution. He explained that leadership wasn't meant to last forever, that real progress required new voices, and that he had done what he came to do. He had broken the silence. He had started the fire. Now it was time to let it grow in the hands of those ready to carry it further. The department didn't collapse without him. It rose. Simone stepped into interim leadership. The oversight board continued its work, now permanently written into the city's charter. The policies stuck because they had been built not on image, but on truth. Malik didn't vanish. He returned to the classroom, teaching criminal justice through the lens of lived experience, building the minds that would one day take the reins. He wrote, not a memoir, but a manual, The Weight of the Badge, a guide for ethical law enforcement rooted in community accountability. He traveled. He spoke. But he never let himself be used as a symbol. He reminded everyone that the story was never about him. It was about what happens when a community refuses to stay silent. The final image of Malik that Shreveport held wasn't of him in uniform, but of him walking through his old neighborhood, hoodie on, greeting people by name. Not the chief. Not the face of justice. Just a man who never forgot where he came from, and who made sure no one else did either. And now, I want to ask you something. How many times have you watched someone suffer injustice and looked away, thinking there was nothing you could do? How many times have you told yourself the system is too big, too broken, too old to change? Malik Henderson proved that even the quietest person, with a steady heart and an unshakable spine, can tear down a wall that stood for generations. He didn't need a revolution. He needed truth. And courage. And the will to keep standing when the world begged him to sit down. So ask yourself, where are you in this story? Are you the one speaking up? The one listening? Or the one still choosing silence? The world doesn't change all at once. It changes in moments. In choices. In people like you deciding that silence is no longer an option. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you feel something, then don't keep that to yourself. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what part of this story stayed with you. Because these stories are not just entertainment. They are mirrors. And sometimes, they're warnings. And if you want more stories like this, real, raw, transformative, subscribe to Tales of Twist. Hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and stay with us. Because the next story might just change the way you see the world.